This is Michael Zehr with Consumer Energy Alliance. We really appreciate all of you joining us today for our Tele-Townhall discussion with Chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Neil Chatterjee. Our discussion today was going to focus on a number of key energy issues before the Commission and how these policies and decisions will affect families, farmers, utilities, and small businesses in North Carolina. Some of the topics we intend to discuss include PURPA reform, the minimum offer price rule, NEPA and energy infrastructure permitting, and the current greenhouse gas analysis used by FERC. We hope the discussion today will help inform our membership and the public about the importance of energy policy and how these decisions affect virtually every family, individual, and business in North Carolina and throughout the country. Consumer Energy Alliance is a nationwide grassroots organization committed to fostering constructive dialogue between energy producers and energy consumers. We support policies at the local, state, and federal level that help ensure access to affordable, reliable, and abundant domestic energy supplies in a manner that ensures the protection of our environment for generations to come. In North Carolina, we've seen firsthand how good energy policy allows for economic growth and environmental progress. Last fall, Consumer Energy Alliance and our team published a report showing that since 1990, the state's achieved significant emissions reductions with 69% reduction in NOx, 92% reductions in SOx, and 58% reduction in VOCs. And this is notable because during that same time, the state's economy grew by 305% and boasted the largest manufacturing workforce in the Southeast and the 8th largest in the United States, employing nearly 500,000 workers. This analysis followed CEA's Energy Savings Report, which found that families, small businesses, and manufacturers across the state saved almost $12 billion over the last 10 years due to low-cost energy. This analysis details how the state achieved those feats despite having no significant in-state energy production while facing substantial demand increases from consumers. On average, just to give a little perspective on North Carolina, the average North Carolinian spends about $3,000 per year to meet their energy needs. With 14% of the state's population living at or below the poverty line, this translates into almost $1 in every $4 in their income going towards energy expenses, which is why energy policy is so important to North Carolina. We're really pleased to have Chairman Chatterjee join us today to answer some of the questions that we have about energy policy and what might be coming up. Chairman Chatterjee was nominated to the FERC Commission by President Trump in May of 2017 and was confirmed by the Senate in August of the same year. He served as chairman from August of 2017 through December, and then was named chairman again in October of 2018. Prior to his time on the commission, Chairman Chatterjee served as a senior advisor to Senate Majority Mitch McConnell, and he played an integral role in passing major energy, highway, and agricultural legislation. I know that from watching it. He was truly spectacular in bringing folks together on those initiatives. Prior to that, Neil Chatterjee worked for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, leading their government affairs. He's originally from Kentucky, and he resides in Virginia with his children. So Chairman Chatterjee, thank you so much for joining us. From the standpoint of CEA, we really care about how energy policies affect families, farmers, and small businesses. That's really where our focus is. But we really appreciate you joining us, and hope you do just some intro remarks, and then we can get into some Q&A, if that works for you.
That's perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. Michael Starton, thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to participate in this Tele-Townhall with the Consumer Energy Alliance, but particularly to engage with an old friend. I miss the days of walking the halls of the Russell Senate office building with you. But I'm so proud to see that you're now working in this capacity. As the nation's largest energy consumer-focused organization, I just really appreciate the opportunity to discuss our work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and how it affects the families, farmers, small businesses, and industrial energy consumers in North Carolina. Before I start, I do have to give some legal disclaimers. The views I express here are my own opinions and don't necessarily reflect those of my fellow commissioners or FERC staff, and the Commission's ex parte rules prevent me from discussing any contested proceedings currently before the Commission. With that, I'll turn to one subject that I wanted to discuss today. Since joining the Commission, bringing our PURPA regulations into the 21st century has been one of my top priorities. It's been more than 4 decades since Congress enacted PURPA, and people tend to overlook the fact that Congress instructed us to review our policies from time to time to ensure that our regulations continue to protect consumers and advance the intent of PURPA. That's why I felt strongly that the Commission should take a fresh, thorough look at our regulations, and I was really pleased that last September we issued our PURPA Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NOPR, focuses on providing flexibility to states while streamlining the Commission's policies and practices. The NOPR includes a comprehensive set of changes to the Commission's regulations, some of which I suspect we'll discuss shortly. Commission staff has been analyzing comments we receive from stakeholders to ensure the changes we ultimately adopt in a final rule are well supported and legally durable. We're working hard to bring this important matter across the finish line in the coming months. With that, I'm happy to open up the floor to you, Michael, and turn to the Q&A portion of this town hall.
No, really appreciate it, Neil and Mr. Chairman. One of the questions that we had regarding PURPA reform was in the NOPR, you're reducing the presumed non-discriminatory threshold for qualifying facilities from 20 megawatts to 1 megawatt. For our members, what does that mean in plain language, and how will that impact energy consumers?
So, I guess before I get into any of the details on the NOPR, I want to clarify that what we're discussing is a proposed rulemaking. And so I just want to be clear that my comments here do not reflect those of the Commission or what may or may not end up in a future final rulemaking. The proposed change that you're asking about, in as close to simple terms as I can get it, would revise the Commission's regulations implementing Section 210M of PURPA, which provides for the termination of an electric utility's obligation to purchase from a QF with non-discriminatory access to regional electricity markets if certain criteria are met. So in reaching a final determination on whether a QF has non-discriminatory access to these markets, the Commission established rebuttable presumptions that QFs at or below 20 megawatt hours do not have non-discriminatory access to those markets, and QFs above 20 megawatt hours do have non-discriminatory access. The Commission's proposal in the NOPR lowers that threshold from 20 megawatts to 1 megawatt for small power production QFs, but retains that 20 megawatt threshold for cogeneration QFs. So in plain language, that means more QFs would participate in the markets, and utilities would be relieved of their obligation to purchase energy and capacity directly from such QFs. And I think because the cost of wind and solar resources has dropped so substantially in recent years, these QFs can compete in the markets and drive down costs for energy consumers.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I know that there were a lot of our folks that were curious about that particular change and how it would impact, which sounds like the effort here is to allow for that competition to take place faster. But one of the other questions that we've had is one of the reforms embraces the idea of time use rates versus the 20-year fixed prices through the contracts. Again, we've got varying degrees of sophistication in terms of membership and awareness of these issues, but kind of curious as you look at shifting from time of use rates versus the 20-year fixed prices. How will that affect? What's the hope in terms of how that would affect prices? And you mentioned renewables, but one of the challenges that's out there is would this make grid planning more complex? And how do you perceive this kind of moving forward in terms of its impact on consumers?
No, thanks. It's a great question. If a state wants to offer 20-year fixed price contracts to QFs, then nothing in the proposed rulemaking will prevent the state from doing so. The proposed rulemaking just provides states the flexibility to require variable energy rates, but I want to be clear, not capacity rates. This proposed change has no impact on the QF's ability to receive fixed capacity rates over the duration of its contract, and I think that's important to stress. That's my long-winded way of saying I have no reason to believe this proposal would make grid planning more complex. Like many other elements of the proposed rulemaking, it's intended to provide additional flexibility to states. The practical outcomes, in large part, depends on state implementation. I could even see states being willing to provide longer-term contracts than they otherwise would entertain, because the risks associated with long-term fixed energy prices falls on the purchasing utility and ultimately the utility's customers. So if states were to move towards longer-term contracts with variable energy prices, it could make long-term planning actually easier on states and the utilities they regulate. I also would just want to point out that it's worth noting that variable energy costs are likely to better reflect the purchasing utility's actual avoided costs for energy in real time. In other words, a move towards variable energy pricing could eliminate the risk that a long-term QF contract has forecasted fixed energy costs that substantially exceed the purchasing utility's avoided costs for energy. When that happens, consumers are stuck with higher energy costs.
Yeah, and that gets to the concept of legally enforceable obligations, which is at play in this rule. As far as those legally enforceable obligations, what exactly is the Commission changing here, and how will it impact the markets?
What we've done is we've proposed to require states to establish objective and reasonable standards that would require a QF to demonstrate commercial viability and financial commitment in order to establish a legally enforceable obligation. We just feel that clear and objective standards would provide QFs and purchasing utilities with certainty. That's what we're aiming for with this proposed rule change. Our aim is to promote fairness and transparency and to discourage speculative projects. We think that will help reduce litigation, increase efficiencies, and lower the overall costs for consumers.
That's excellent. Mr. Chairman, as you kind of look at the progress on this, do you have any sense on timing and the way the process will move forward for PURPA reform?
I don't want to make any projections on timing. I never make any predictions. That said, what I will say is the Commission staff is working incredibly hard on this. My colleagues are working incredibly hard on this. My team is working incredibly hard on this. We transitioned the Commission to full telework, I guess about 10 weeks ago now, and I've been really impressed at how the incredible staff here have adapted to that. And these are obviously challenging circumstances, but they're going full speed ahead. And so that's my long-winded way of saying the timeline is not going to be impacted by the pandemic. but I still am not going to make a projection on the timeline. Just please know we're working very, very hard to complete this.
No, and I think that's a good point. With the last few months, it's been unprecedented, the kinds of challenges that everybody has faced. But I was just kind of curious if you might be able to give us a little bit more flavor for how you guys have had to adapt. I mean, during this time, I think ensuring that the provision of energy has been absolutely essential, with critical workforces declared and continued efforts to keep things moving forward. I was curious if you might be able to describe some of the Commission's response during this time in terms of the hearings and regulation and coordination with state regulators, and every day we're hearing more concerns about grid security and protecting essential workers. So just so much has changed over the last few weeks and months. I'm just curious if you could give us some examples of how the Commission is responding.
Sure. Look, we recognized early on just how vital the sharing of information would be during the pandemic. That's why one of our first steps was to develop new processes to improve information sharing and make additional resources available to our stakeholders. In March, I named Caroline Wozniak, a longtime FERC staffer, as the Commission's pandemic liaison. She and a dedicated team of 14 staff are just working round the clock to answer any and all COVID-related inquiries, because that's important for people to know that there's a human being that they can get in touch with to raise relevant issues. Caroline recently recorded a podcast to discuss what she and her team are doing to assist regulated entities. I encourage you guys to check it out. It's on FERC's coronavirus webpage on our FERC.gov site. We're constantly updating that site with pandemic-related announcements and news releases and relevant Commission orders and notices. I don't want to spare you the details. The Commission has also issued a number of orders and notices to provide transparency and reduce burdens on our regulated community. We've extended deadlines where appropriate, issued a policy statement to make clear that we will give the highest priority to processing filings made for the purpose of assuring the reliable operation of energy infrastructure during the emergency. We're also working very closely with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. FERC and NERC published a joint coronavirus statement which outlines steps that we're taking to ensure that system operators can focus their resources on safety and keeping the lights on during the pandemic. We're also in close coordination with our federal and state partners. My colleagues and I have all participated in regular calls with the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, which is the primary liaison between the federal government and the electric utility industry. We've also held several calls with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, to keep the lines of communication open with our state partners, our state regulators. And the Commission, in fact, issued a joint statement with NARUC encouraging states to consider utility workers as essential for critical infrastructure. I also recently joined the Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, in reaching out to governors across the country to ensure that our essential workers are receiving the support they need during the pandemic. This is only kind of a fraction of the actions that we've taken at the Commission. We're also looking to the future. We announced yesterday that we'll be holding a virtual technical conference in July to really focus on some of the questions and challenges that will face the entire energy sector when we come out of this pandemic, when we get up off the mat, when the American economy fully reopens. There's no doubt that this pandemic has had an impact on the energy sector across the board. And while we may not have all the answers, I think it's important to bring experts together to ask difficult questions and try and find a path forward. So to sum up, I think what the Commission has done is really on three fronts. One, we recognized that the pandemic was going to change circumstances for some regulated entities, and we wanted to alleviate regulatory burdens and provide greater transparency. Two, we're open for business, and I really credit the staff and my colleagues for making that transition to full telework, and have had a number of stakeholders throughout the regulated community express to me how significant it is and how grateful it is simply knowing that the commission is completing its business in as close to normal as possible. That certainty, knowing that we're open and working, has really provided a comfort and relief and certainty to stakeholders. And finally, now engaging in this forward-looking discussion, putting our expertise to use, using our convening power to try and have a conversation now so that we're not reacting but can be proactive from a regulatory standpoint, from a stakeholder standpoint, when the country gets back on its feet.
I think looking at how we come out of this and how you guys have been able to continue moving forward is really admirable. I think in terms of the work that CEA has been doing on energy infrastructure projects, we think that there's a tremendous opportunity for the energy industry appropriately to help in terms of putting people back to work and providing additional grid modernization and other efforts that are out there. But the FERC's efforts in this area will be absolutely critical to moving that forward. But with that said, FERC has been one of the real key linchpins in building out our energy infrastructure across the country, especially in terms of pipelines and LNG terminals, which you guys have been processing at great levels to help get people to work and help move these products along. Just kind of curious, as you look at coming out of this and some of the projects that are coming along, during your time at FERC, what are some of the initiatives that you guys have sort of led to help deal with some of the concerns about some of these projects, while also making sure that there is certainty for the actual builders and financiers of these critical infrastructure projects?
So look, our job is to stay in accordance with our obligations under the Natural Gas Act. So my colleagues and I, staff at the Commission, we have a rigorous process in place. Our process is not easy. It's not short. It's not inexpensive. But we really closely and carefully evaluate projects, evaluate their environmental impact, evaluate safety implications. And I think during my 3 years at the Commission, I've been proud of how we have handled our responsibilities under the Natural Gas Act in this manner. You can always find ways to do things better. Some of the things I'm proud of are the result of some greater efficiencies that we've been able to put into our process. For instance, our responsibilities in evaluating certificate applications for liquefied natural gas export facilities. What we discovered was there was a lot of duplicative regulation that was taking place between the Commission and PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So we reached a memorandum of understanding with PHMSA to basically better streamline and align the process without sacrificing safety, without sacrificing environmental compliance. We found other ways to eliminate red tape and duplicative bureaucracy, and I think have a more efficient but still rigorous process.
I think that's one of the real key things is, as we've looked at a number of the regulatory reform efforts, is oftentimes they, for some of the folks and some of the coverage that we've seen, reform is equated with doing away with these environmental reviews. And from the standpoint of CEA, we want to make sure that environmental reviews are comprehensive and that they're done the right way, because we really do believe that energy programs and energy infrastructure and the development can be done in a way that can actually help enhance the environment, that this really doesn't have to be a trade-off. But along those lines, the Council for Environmental Quality is reviewing public comments right now for the NEPA regulations. I know you talk with a number of your colleagues, and you don't want to speculate on timing for things before FERC, but I was curious if you had any insight when some of the proposed NEPA regulations will be finalized, and whether the proposed changes will be helpful to FERC's environmental review process for the projects that we were just talking about.
So I don't know when they'll be final, but I will say I'm really encouraged that CEQ is undertaking what is the first NEPA update in more than 40 years. This could significantly reduce the unnecessary administrative burdens of conducting NEPA reviews while maintaining the underlying commitment to the statute's environmental mandates. In particular, I really appreciate CEQ's attempts to clarify the NEPA process in order to just minimize unnecessary litigation regarding procedural matters. This really has the potential to pave the way to a better and more efficient review of FERC projects. Like I said, I think we have a good process in place, but you can always make it better.
No, we appreciate it. As we look at a lot of these projects that are out there, we're seeing a number of court cases, eminent domain issues, state obstruction on Clean Water Act permits, and we were just talking about NEPA permitting. But these landowner disputes really have been taken to new levels over the last few years as we look at a number of these projects. We know that you guys have created a new landowner office. I was curious if you might be able to sort of explain some of that effort and some of the steps involved that you guys have really tried to engage more with landowners early on.
So we have extensive comment and participation opportunities built into our current processes, but we're constantly looking for ways to give the public an even better understanding of our processes and what they mean for landowners and communities, and how to ensure every perspective is heard. Look, I am very aware that the decisions we make impact lives, and I've been particularly concerned with ensuring that landowners have a voice in our processes. So we've created a new landowner section on our FERC.gov site that puts all the important information relevant to landowners in one easy-to-find section. We'll continue to provide that one-stop convenience for affected landowners when our new redesigned FERC.gov website debuts later this year. I also instituted a new expedited process for addressing rehearing requests by affected landowners. Additionally, I announced the creation of an entire new section within our Office of General Counsel, which is designed specifically to give first priority to landowner rehearing requests. This will allow for more timely action on expected landowner requests for rehearing.
That's excellent. As we're continuing to look at these proceedings, one of the issues that has come up fairly regularly, and we have a number of members that are very progressive in terms of wanting to do their part to address carbon emissions and looking to be proactive on those efforts. As we look at the projects and some of the things that have gone on at FERC, there's been quite a bit of debate regarding quantifying greenhouse gas emissions for natural gas pipeline projects and the significance of those emissions with respect to climate change. In your opinion, do you think FERC will continue with its current mode of greenhouse gas emissions analysis? And just with the way you guys have handled that, maybe go through that a bit, because there's been some dispute, quite a bit of writing on it. And then have any of the recent court rulings changed or perhaps confirmed what FERC should consider in its greenhouse gas analysis to meet what's required under NEPA and the Natural Gas Act?
Look, let me just answer your question by stating right at the top, I believe that climate change is real, that man has a significant impact, and that greenhouse gas emissions are a serious matter. When greenhouse gas emissions are caused by a project, the Commission includes those emissions as part of its NEPA review. I firmly believe that the Commission's orders provide a thoughtful, thorough, and legally appropriate environmental review. Period, point blank.
What would you say to there are some folks that are looking at these developments and wondering, are there additional activities that may be coming from FERC in terms of investigating greenhouse gas emissions and carbon kind of moving into the future? Are there other efforts underway at FERC that are looking into this, and places where some of our members who want to be helpful and want to be productive in terms of trying to find solutions? What are some of the ways that they could engage with you guys to along?
It's not us, it's Congress. We are fulfilling our obligations under the Natural Gas Act. If parties are desirous to see changes in how the Commission goes about its analysis, I think it's incumbent upon that direction to come from Congress, and FERC will follow the law. I don't believe that we should be rewriting laws unilaterally.
Good, you're an institutionalist from the legislative branch. That's good. Shifting gears just a little bit. I guess late last year, with the minimum offer price rule that was brought forward, it's garnered a significant amount of attention and conjecture. Curious, very similar to when we were talking about PURPA and kind of layman's terms, if you could explain kind of the intent and the practical impact it may have on prices in electricity markets.
Sure. Look, in layman's terms, the minimum offer price rule, or MOPR orders, are intended to create an even playing field for all capacity resources, particularly in PJM, where you have a multi-state footprint. Under these orders, resources that receive a state subsidy are subject to that minimum offer price floor. The MOPR prevents those resources from being able to offer at prices lower than their actual costs, which would place them at an advantage over non-subsidized resources. So by taking these actions, we're ensuring that PJM's capacity market remains a fair and competitive market that is shielded from distortions caused by state subsidies. When we protect the functioning of competitive markets, it benefits consumers for years to come. I also would like to respond to suggestions that the MOPR orders will result in substantial price increases for consumers, including large manufacturers, because that's one of the arguments that has been made against the MOPR orders. Quite frankly, the evidence does not support those claims. PJM's own independent market monitor estimates that the next PJM capacity auction will clear at prices that are substantially similar to the most recent PJM capacity auction. Ultimately, our orders will ensure the PJM capacity market incentivizes the entry of competitive resources and exit of uncompetitive resources, and in the long run, that equates to substantial cost savings for consumers. And I want to address one other point. There are some people that are perhaps pushing out this notion that the MOPR orders were designed to prop up fossil fuels and hinder the growth of renewables. And I have to say, I am a big believer in the business case for clean energy and the business case for renewables. I think at their onset, yes, renewables relied upon subsidies and mandates to get a foothold in markets. I think today the cost of renewables have dropped to the point where they can compete on their own footing without subsidies, And I don't believe that the MOPR will have a detrimental effect on renewables in the future. I think the cost of renewables is going to continue to decline, and therefore I truly believe that the projected negative consumer impacts and negative impact to renewables that some are foreseeing is just not accurate. And I think ultimately what these orders will do is provide better price signals, more accurate price signals in the market, which will lead to more efficient markets that have already demonstrated tremendous benefits to consumers and the environment, benefits that I believe will continue and grow under these orders.
Now, I think that addresses one of the primary concerns that we've heard from some, that depending on how this gets implemented, how it would impact a lot of the renewable projects that are out there, both short term and in the long term, and how some of these states are going to react as this moves forward. I was just curious, have through this process and some of the meetings and the comments that have come back, do you get a sense on where the states may be headed with this, and how are you guys coordinating with the states and some of the developers as they're looking at this? And I think everybody shares a desire to see more energy infrastructure built and want to see competitive markets in a way that can allow for consumers to benefit. But there's a lot of concern, and I'm just curious if you could maybe address that a bit more in terms of price and those specific concerns on those projects.
I can't obviously get into the specifics. There's still a lot of variables regarding implementation and compliance that need to get worked out. It's still a pending contested matter, so I'll only speak at a high level. And look, there's been a lot of attention to this, as you mentioned. There's been a lot of media focus on it. There's been a lot of talk about states potentially withdrawing from the PJM capacity markets, and this leading to the end of the PJM capacity markets. My message to folks is, let's let this process play out. Let's see how the first couple of auctions go. And not just me, not just my colleagues, PJM's own independent market monitor, believe that this will have a positive effect on markets, have positive benefits for consumers, and the projected scenarios that some are very concerned about will not come to pass. So my simple message to stakeholders across the board is, be patient. Let's see how the process plays out. Let's see how the MOPR is implemented. Let's see how the auctions go. Let's not make decisions based on hypothetical projections.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we're getting kind of close to our time here, Neil. But one of the questions that we wanted you to address as well has to do more with kind of some of the areas that we work in terms of dialogue and in terms of moving things forward. This is a really complex time. There's more opportunities for energy consumers. There's more options, whether it's residential solar, wind, more access to natural gas, lower price natural gas. We've seen the benefits in North Carolina with lower cost energy and lower cost at the pump. But with these changes, there's a lot of debate, and it's important that we have the debate and move forward in a constructive manner. But for a number of years now, we've seen sort of anti-development groups, and you could call them anti-energy groups, have sought to kind of politicize what has historically been more of an engineering process at FERC, and have gone so far as to protest and harass some commissioners in public or even at their own homes. We've seen the use of sort of these disruptive bullying tactics to expand in recent years in an effort to intimidate officials at both state and federal levels. I'm just curious, how have you and your fellow commissioners, and we know that you have very different views on a number of issues, very strongly held views. How have you guys dealt with these activities, and what are you guys doing at the commission, and what can be done in general to promote a more constructive discourse?
So, it's tough. On the one hand, look, I fundamentally believe in the First Amendment and people's rights to speak their mind. And I empathize with a lot of people who have concerns about the work that the commission does. And I want them to feel respected, and I want to ensure that their voices are heard. And I think we do a pretty good job. We could always do a better job of ensuring that all parties and all manner of view are heard by the commission. I think the structure of the commission, being a multi-member bipartisan board, gives an opportunity for different viewpoints to be considered, and I think that's important as we go about our decision making. And so I truly respect and value thoughtful, constructive dialogue. The disruptors, though, it's unfortunate, and particularly when staff of the commissioners' families have been brought into these things. The current composition of the commission, all of us have young families at home, and for some of our children to be worried about their parents going to work, that's really unfortunate. And look, we're all just trying to serve the public. And for us to, feel this sense of intimidation in trying to do our jobs is really unfortunate. You've known me for a number of years, both in my prior role and here. My door is always open. I try to accommodate every meeting request and hear from people with all different points of view. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the decisions that we make at the commission are not political ones. They're ones that are done within the parameters of the statutes that govern the agency, the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act. And what I would simply tell folks, because there has been concern about the politicization of the agency, that they should have confidence that these decisions aren't political simply because there is so much accountability in our process. First and foremost, we're accountable to the staff. The staff here at the commission are genuine experts, engineers, economists, lawyers, environmental analysts, and they're the ones that do the bulk of the work in either responding to filings at the commission or whether it comes to producing generic rulemakings. And so the work that is ultimately shaped by the chairman and commissioners comes through the staff, and so already it's going to be within the parameters of the commission's jurisdictions and those legal statutes. Secondarily, we're accountable to each other. I'm accountable to my colleagues. I'm not a unilateral executive. My colleagues all have the opportunities to vote for things. They're all independent in their own right and can vote different ways and write different statements, concurrences, and dissents to ensure that a wide array of voices are heard. Most significantly and importantly, in my view, we're accountable to the courts. The decisions that this commission makes are often litigated, and ultimately, if we prevail in the courts, to me, that is what I try and strive for in getting out an order, is legal durability. Will this withstand legal scrutiny? A nakedly political order would never survive the courts, and I think that's another measure of accountability that people can have confidence in. We're accountable to Congress. Both the Senate and House have oversight ability over the commission and can utilize that oversight authority to make sure that we are complying with the laws and statutes that govern the agency. And finally, we're accountable to the press and the public. And the press does a very good job of covering the commission. I think the press corps that covers the commission is particularly talented because the complexity and sophistication of the work that the commission does sometimes is very nuanced and weedy, and I think the press corps does a good job of taking these complex issues and breaking them down so they're easily digestible to the public, so the public can hold us accountable. So that's my very long-winded way of saying, A, it is possible to have a constructive dialogue, and I understand people are frustrated, but they should feel confident that their voices are being heard here at the Commission. And secondarily, there should not be concerns on either side about politicization at the Commission, because there are so many guardrails in place to ensure that would never happen.
Yeah. Well, just with some of the things that we've seen, you and your colleagues have got to have a pretty thick skin. Just with some of the efforts that we've seen both online, and I know there've been even some pretty funny videos that they've put out, and some other things. And you've always taken it in good humor. But you are a man in the arena, so to speak. And so it was a little, as we come to the end, give you a chance to either make news or not. But I personally was very surprised when I saw the notes about a potential governor's run for you. And I don't know if I wasn't so surprised that you would run for something, because God knows we need good people in office, and you're a great one. But I was surprised it was Virginia and not Kentucky. So I'm just curious if there's anything you'd like to clarify on that, because we looked at it and I thought, wow, was there a typo? So anything you want to add?
To be completely clear, I was joking around. It was. Look, I've been cooped up at home for 10 weeks. I love my family. I love my kids. There's only so much, I can do. I'm very bad at Fortnite, so my kids don't let me play. And I was looking to. You've known me for a number of years. You know I've got a sense of humor. I was looking to try and get a reaction or rise out of my personal friends on social media. It was not meant for public dissemination, and I was totally and unseriously goofing around.
Well, at some point in time, I hope you stay in the arena, and we look forward to following you and everything that you intend to do, kind of moving forward. But Neil, you've been very gracious with your time. We're a bit over now of what we had planned for, but I wanted just, if there's anything that we didn't get to cover that you want to make sure gets out there, either regarding PURPA, the NOPR, the MOPR, or anything else that you guys are working on that you think it's important for our membership and for folks in North Carolina to be aware of.
No, look, I think we covered a lot substantively. What I appreciate is you convening a forum like this. I think at all times, the work of your government is important, and the public needs to be aware of what the government is doing. I think particularly in difficult times like this, where the entire country is grappling with the same difficult challenge, communication is essential. The consumer's voice is so important and needs to be heard at the Commission. And so I think the work that your organization does, convening a forum like this, having a back and forth like this, so that consumers are aware of what the Commission's doing and how it might impact them, is so important. And so I just thank you for what you do and for putting this together.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. We will wrap this session up, but again, huge thanks to Chairman Chatterjee with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we look forward to doing a few more of these series. And but thank everybody for joining us today.